nice to see you. You know Dr. Miller? Had you met before?
I've been watching him.
You've been watching
just
him?
now.
Over the years, or just
No, just the last few minutes.
I see. You're a man. I've been reading as much as I could about you, and I want to read more. I find you so interesting, and it seems like you're
I'll
one of those.
send you some books.
Would you? I have two already. Are there
There's
more?
a lot more than that. Yes.
All right. You could obviously have done any number of things with your life, with your background, and with your education and all. And why politics? What snapped you into politics?
Well, it happened like this. I was born in 1912, so I took my degree in 33, and I went abroad to Europe, where I was studying and reading manuscripts. But by the time I came home in 1935, I was quite certain that there was going to be a European war. And indeed, I expected it to come sooner than it did. So that the whole of that part of my life was essentially provisional. I thought, well, I'll start this book, but I shan't finish it because the war will come. Still, I may as well amuse myself in the meantime. And that went on till 1939, by which time I was a professor in Australia. So when the war started, I came home, joined up, and one's mind was blinkered during the war. There was nothing but the war. And it wasn't until 1944 that the idea suddenly hit me. Good Lord, you may survive. What are you going to do afterwards? There may be a whole life in front of you.
You had assumed up to that point you might not survive?
Well, naturally, one thought of a Second World War in terms of a First World War, and therefore the probability was anyhow that it would be the end. And at that moment, I was in India at the time, but at that moment, there was the decision, well, I shall go into politics. Now, why? That's not so easy to say. I'd always been an imperialist in the old British sense of a term.
Yes.
I suppose I was very impressed, very thrilled with India, even at the end of the British Raj. But I think there was a lot more to it than that. I think I'd come to feel that politics sums up so much else in life. It touches life at so many points. Plato said of philosophy that it's the architectural science. It, as it were, comprehends all the rest. Well, to me, politics, in a way, contains all the rest. And so I've been happy ever since.
Yeah. You had a great passion for Germany up to just before the war. I remember reading that part.
Things German until the mid-30s.
Yes.
And then I was torn apart. German music, German philosophy, they were a tremendous influence on me as a boy and a young man. And then this caricature, this breaking open took place, which I could hardly believe at first. I remember it 30th of June, 1st of July, 1934, the Röhm massacre. I remember being stunned. It seems in recollection to be for hours at the time, to try to imagine that such a thing could happen.
The Röhm massacre?
Yes.
He was a brown shirt, wasn't he?
That's right, the massacre of the brown shirts.
Yeah.
Something which was so inconceivable in any civilized society under the rule of law. And here was the nation from whom one had learnt so much, in philosophy and poetry and so on. It wasn't possible. So one was torn. And in a sense, I've been torn ever since. I'm ambivalent about Germany and things German to this day, and I suppose I shall die like that.
How many languages do you speak?
Well, speak freely,
Yeah.
only 3 or 4, but read with more or less facility, 10 or 12.
You once set yourself a goal, I read at least, of learning one a
Well,
year.
it wasn't
Have
a
you kept
goal,
that up?
but before the war, when I was a Don, in that period when I was waiting for the war, I did notch up one language a year. It worked out roughly on that average. But I haven't learnt a new language since the war. In the war, I learnt Urdu in India. In fact, I became an interpreter in it. And I learnt a certain amount of Persian, because you can't do Urdu properly without Persian. But for the last 25 years, I've lived on my stock.
I've never heard Urdu. How would you say we have to take a station break and we'll be back?
Oh, I say, I dare say none of that had been invented at the time when
There is no word for station
But
break.
I'll quote for you, if you like, the Urdu for Urdu.
Which is?
Zaban-e-Urdu-em Ala, which means the language of the imperial army, because it was a sort of mixed language which arose in India with the soldiers in the Mughal armies and the camp followers, and so it's a mixture of Sanskrit and of Persian or Arabic.
Enoch, it's not easy. It doesn't,
That's all right. Everybody does it.
It doesn't come easy. There's been so many jokes about England losing, Britain, I mean, losing India. Were you sad when India was lost?
Yes, very.
What does that mean? Why?
Because it had seemed to me that India was a sort of joint entity with Britain. You see, what people talk about as the British Empire was really the Indo-British Empire. India was the center of it. And so much of British policy and British defense depended upon this link with India and the maintenance of that link with India. Indeed, even Australia and New Zealand and the Far East, they were to Britain the things the other side of India. And it was from India that both the Middle East and the Far East were seen. And it's difficult nowadays, but important, to recover what was the central significance of India to whole generations of Englishmen. Now, it happened in my generation that we had to unlearn. And I suppose a good deal of my political life since 1947 has been learning that there was a pre-imperial Britain, and that therefore there would be a post-imperial Britain, and that the self-respect and the greatness of Britain didn't depend, as we had allowed them to tell us, as we had told ourselves for so many years, on having those great possessions and those great stretches of a map. And if I had to summarize in one sentence what I think I'm trying to do in politics, I'm trying to tell the people of Britain that they don't have to be big to be great.
Yes. If they wanted to be big now, what good would it do them? I don't mean that.
Exactly so.
Yeah.
And I think that, in the attempt to join the common market, and I'm opposed to that,
Yes.
there's a great deal of this instinctive post-imperial wish to be big. If we've lost the empire, the crude idea runs, let's join something else big. What is it? Oh, yes, Europe. And you hear people going about saying Britain would regain a voice in the councils of the world by being part of Europe. Well, that's really nonsense, you know. We should simply be merged in something very different, or at any rate, be all the time refusing to be merged in it, and there's not much future in that. After all, Britain was Britain long before there was an empire, and she had what was afterwards recognized as the empire, long before the imperialists came along, right at the end of the 19th century, and told the British, you know, you're great because you've got a great empire. It was a very late development. It was almost a decadent development. It was all crammed into that last 10 or 15 years before World War I. But the time and the ideas that are most difficult to escape from are those of the world that you were born into. And being born just before World War I, it was all these ideas, the ideas of imperialism, which were the air that one breathed as a child and a young man. I suppose every generation has to recover from what it was taught in its youth.
Governor Maddox, I still call you governor. don't I?
Call me most anything you want to. Everybody else does. Help
right.
yourself, Dick.
Have you ever followed bugs before?
Just a few moments ago on your program, sir.
That's the only time. What does this mean? You're going to become the lieutenant governor. What will your responsibilities be then?
Be presiding officer of the Georgia State Senate.
Uh-huh. Will you miss the governorship?
Well, I'll still have a lot to do as lieutenant governor of the state of Georgia. Of course, it's a very confining, very important post as presiding officer and president of the Senate, and programming the legislation to the various committees within the Senate, assigning members of the Senate to the various committees. And so it'll keep me busy.
Sounds like it.
Yes.
Sounds like it. All right, I was going to say, do you feel that you have lived up to your 1964 platform?
1966, I believe, Dick. You know,
that too.
Right. You know, you never accomplish all that you want to. You set your goals at such heights that you are always working to reach something higher. Mm-hmm. But we've accomplished so many things that we promised the people, like we told them that we would have a government of, for, and by the people, involve them in the state government as never before, that we'd promote honesty and efficiency in government, mm-hmm. and that we told them the State House or any level of government does not just belong to the Democrats or the Republicans or the rich or the poor, the young or old, black or white, but it belongs to all of our citizens. And so these things, and promoting the educational advances and our industrialization of our state, we're in an industrial revolution at this time, our prison reform, mental health programs, and all. So we're pleased but not satisfied, and we'll never be satisfied so long as there's anything left undone.
I see. You don't drink, do you?
It depends on what you're talking about.
No, I had read that you were a teetotaler.
Alcoholic beverages, I don't drink, no, sir.
Ah, yeah. I need to deprive yourself of all liquids, but I wondered if... Now, I read a curious thing that you had sent out cards to every member of the legislature in Georgia asking them to sign them that they would not drink or smoke. What was that?
No, we sent out some to a group of young people all over the state and on different mailing lists, and someone within the office, and we had a lot of young people join in this Governor's Youth Council on Tobacco, Alcohol, and Health, mm-hmm. and a large number of them throughout the state joined in this program. And someone had picked up a mailing list that included some members of the General Assembly, and inadvertently it got out. It was not intended to go to the members of the General Assembly, because it would still be a good idea if they could go along with it.
If they wouldn't drink or smoke.
Yes.
I had heard that one of them responded that he could go along with you on the smoking thing, but that as long as you were governor, he would have to keep drinking. Did you hear about that?
Yes, sir. You know, and probably got some few more of them. Possibly may have we stopped some of them from drinking, maybe some more from drinking. You know, the thing about being governor, you know, they predicted in 1966. In fact, some of the people told me, says it'd be a cold day when you get elected, and sure enough, it was. It's 32 degrees that day. But you know, so it wasn't too surprising to the people who really know the type program that we offered and so forth.
Would you say you are?
All we had to do was beat all the city halls, all the courthouses, the state and national Democrats and Republicans, and the television stations, the railroads, the banks, and utility companies, but it wasn't too hard, and so...
Other than that, it was easy
yes, sir,
sledding,
it was all right, and we did have a few people running in different directions because they lost their little pet place to maybe live off of the taxpayers free of charge.
Well, I introduced you as maybe a misunderstood man, and when we get back to this message, I'd like to know how you think you are misunderstood. Fair enough?
Whatever you say, sir.
All right. Oh, really? Governor Maddox, Southerners always complain that Northerners can never understand them, and Southern politicians claim that Northerners get a distorted picture of them. Where has the picture we've gotten of you been most distorted?
Well, you know, I think sometimes Northerners say they can't understand Southerners, and Southerners say they can't understand Northerners, but the way I look at this country today, everything's Southern, you know, from Canada on down to the tip of Florida. So far as any misunderstanding west of Maddox, I think the only, if there is misunderstanding, there is in areas, is where the truth hasn't been told. People have been, well, oftentimes by the news media, Dick, they've portrayed things that would discredit and leave out things that would be favorable, and publish and broadcast the things that would be unfavorable. In other words, we hear a lot about the generation gap in this country today, but I don't say that we have too much of a generation gap. I think the greatest gap we have is one of honesty and truth. And if we close the gaps of honesty and truth, it would close a lot of the other gaps. And the truth is not being told oftentimes to the people about Lester Maddox or about a lot of other things in this country.
Does the phrase lying devils and dirty dogs ring a bell?
Not too much.
Oh, you were quoted as calling the Atlanta Constitution, and what's the other paper that you're battling with constantly? Or aren't the two papers, the ones where you heed
I call
the
those two papers the fish wrappers.
fish wrappers?
Right. You had the bugs here a while ago, and I call those what they have there, the fish.
What is it that they don't, why can't you and they get on the same wavelength?
Well, because they can't control the governor's office while I'm governor. And a lot of our programs, like in our educational program, you don't know this, and normally it wouldn't be found out across the country except through where we can get the truth. In our university system, we have gained more from our budget in the last 4 years than in the previous 185 years in the University of Georgia. We have gained more in our industrial growth in the past 4 years than all the other 21 years since World War II.
That sounds good.
And we've had more penal reform in the state during this period than all the history of the state.
I know you've surprised a
So
number.
you don't get these things across to the people, and I don't suppose hardly anyone in the country knows that we are really experiencing an industrial revolution that far exceeds any other time in the history of our state.
I know that you banned mini skirts and asked that the people working in the Capitol have their hair cut over the ears.
Well, I did not ban them, no, sir, and I told them that I thought they would look better if they would be decently dressed and decently groomed. And I believe this about any person.
You think the mini skirt's indecent?
Well, I think sometimes when they can get to the position where they are, yes, sir.
The position where they are?
Right, sir.
I won't press you on that.
No, sir.
What does pick-rick mean?
Well, pick means to fastidiously eat, to pick out, to select, to choose. Rick means to pile up, to heap or to mass. And so I put the two words together and made the name Pick-Rick. And on our menus and our newspaper advertisements, we said, in defining the word, we said, you pick it out, we rick it up. And this is what made it Pick-Rick.
I guess the most famous picture of you is the one that's about to come up on the screen. Do you remember this photograph?
Yes, sir. Everybody else does, I believe.
I think they do.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. What comes to your mind when you see that?
That's when the SNCC people out of New York and New Jersey, along with Bobby Kennedy and some of the others that were determined to destroy the rights to private property for black people and white people and all people in this country, came out of New York and New Jersey to invade my restaurant.
All to invade your restaurant?
And to show you something else about that picture that you had on the screen, see, that was a pick handle someone had there, and the news media, even your program, all of them all over the country call it an axe handle. You don't know the difference. And that's what...
Oh, wait a minute,
never
let me be clear on that.
has been an axe handle.
It was always called an axe handle, and it's a pick handle?
Well, yes, sir, but the news media never gives the truth to the people, and this was part of it.
See, they really do distort things, don't they?
Well, they really do.
I hadn't realized it.
This is going to call for an explanation of why the pick handle was there.
Yeah.
The pick had to do with the name in our restaurant. And also that the pick handle, the pick denotes hard work. And we had in the restaurant an old fireplace. We had carved stagecoaches. We had old trains. We had spinning wheels, player pianos, and things like this. And we had some of these pick handles, two kegs of them by a big old fireplace where we burned hickory wood. And there were 6 of them in each of the kegs. And they were dark red because that was it looked something similar to a chicken leg, a pick handle does. Not like the axe handle that the news media talks about. So we had the pick handles in the kegs, and they were painted dark red because the chicken leg is a darker meat than the rest of the chicken. And the people in the country don't know that this is why we had those in our restaurant there, and why we used the pick handle in part of the decor of our restaurant.
Well, I've certainly learned a lot.
Well, you might, by appearing on your program, maybe have enlightened some other people about the truth about the situation instead of what has been portrayed across the United States of America to black people and white people all over the country.
What do you think that is? Who's behind all this distortion?
Well, it's just oftentimes people in the news media are dealing in sensationalism and not wanting to be fair and honest. You know, you look right now, most of the things that go on television and in the newspaper about our young people are the ones that are going wrong and making mistakes, and yet we got over 95% of them doing a good job of helping us to build up, to be good citizens, behave themselves, and they get very little attention. It's just the misfits that get all the attention. And this is true about our government. Very little is published and broadcast about what is really good about our people and about our government.
Do you still have any interest in the Pick Rick restaurant?
We don't have a Pick Rick restaurant.
You had to let it go or something, didn't you?
Yes, sir, I lost it.
Did you cook your own chicken, or did you call Colonel Sanders in when you were running it?
Well, we had good chicken.
Yeah. Would you speak to Colonel Sanders if you met him on the street?
Well, he's a great fellow. I admire him. I appreciate him. He was almost forced out of his business because of some, I think, highway development, and he began to sell his recipe and turned it into millions of dollars. And he's a great American. He's a smart American. And he has a good product. All of our chicken, though, was pan-fried chicken. None of it pressure-cooked, and none of it cooked in the, what they call the deep fat fry.
Ah, okay. Hi, I'm Dick Cavett. At the beginning of this year, a man named Rudolph Giuliani was famous for packing off a flock of Wall Streeters and some politicians to the slammer, and was considered a shoo-in to be the next mayor of New York City. By September, Mr. Giuliani was so far down in the polls, he was considered a sure loser. And 2 weeks ago, Mr. Giuliani astonished everyone, not to mention the pollsters, who were still trying to explain it, by coming within 2 percentage points of being the next mayor of the city of New York. And off of this roller coaster ride, Mr. Giuliani has returned to earth, probably with some might-have-beens bumping around in his psyche. So here, fresh from the recovery room, he has come by for a chat about post-electoral tryst, you might say, or something. Sorry about all that. But you do seem remarkably chipper for a man who's been through the grinder.
It was a real experience, and it was up and down, and I guess that made it more exciting.
You know, when you think about it, in our time, the number of politicians who've gone into serious depressions, even suicidal ones in some cases, after the campaign, that even almost some of the best, more durable-seeming ones talk about it. You had no big letdown?
No, really very little. Some, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, you miss the excitement of it and all the people. Mostly you feel bad for all those people that work so hard, and you feel like you let them down a little bit, and that bothers me. But
Well, also different from what some politicians have been through is that you, in a sense, we're getting closer and closer. What I'm trying to say is it must have been exhilarating to come so close.
it reminded me a little of Vince Lombardi used to have this attitude about the Green Bay Packers that they never lost a game, they just ran out of time.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
I guess we all feel like if we had 3 or 4 more days, we were just about there.
Well, it's a dangerous thing to say to a prosecutor, but tell me the truth. Were you surprised?
Was I surprised?
Were you surprised at how close it came at the end? Could you have predicted it in a sealed envelope?
No, I don't think so. I think I thought we were either going to win it by a very little bit or lose it by 8 or 10 points. I didn't know, having never been through it before, I didn't know which to believe, the polls or the enthusiasm of the people. For the last 4 or 5 weeks, the enthusiasm was mounting tremendously. Every place I'd go, people were yelling, screaming, seemed very, very strongly in favor of me. At the same time, the polls were ranging between 14 and 20 points behind.
Right.
And not being a professional at this, I didn't know which one was right. Either one of 2 things was going to happen. We're going to get wiped out, like the polls say, or we're going to win by a few points.
But you know whether to believe the cheering throng, which is only people after all, or the wisdom of the pollsters who are scientific.
So from now on, I will believe the people, not the wisdom of the pollsters.
They've fallen all over themselves explaining that, of course, they weren't surprised at all by any of this, and that could easily happen. What is their convincing argument? I haven't seen it yet.
I don't know what it is. Actually, the election will be less than 40,000 votes, which will be less than 2%, and something like 5 votes an election district. So, and all of their polls were 14% or higher. So it's very, and that's just a few days before the election.
That's way off.
It was way, way off, and there are any number of explanations for it, I guess. It actually hurt us because it kept money from us, and it kept people who were on the fence from really joining us because they were afraid that it was a lost cause.
Yeah, I think that's worth emphasizing. How can polls hurt you? People read them and think, I'm not going to put money into this guy. It's clear he's lost because this paper, and this paper all say so. And yet you
We were at one point 30.
Better off then than you knew.
Right. We were at something like 34 points behind at one point in one poll, which I always knew was a poll that was way off because it was always about 10 points off. But it dissuaded people from giving us money.
Do those pollsters still have customers after that one?
It may have been a tough election to poll because the vote was so different depending on the communities that you poll, that if you didn't predict the turnout, I guess it threw the numbers way off.
And something that I hadn't really thought of before, that how often people may lie, even though you'd think they'd have very little to lose by telling someone with a pencil and a board what they did or how they voted. But in this case, there were some certain circumstances that
it may have accounted for a few of the percent. I still don't think they can explain the tremendous disparity that occurred.
No, I don't either. And I think I love having polls and such things called into question. I hate knowing who's won an election that I haven't voted in yet.
The exit polls on the night of the election were the most unusual of all, because on the moment the television stations went on, they predicted that my opponent was going to win by 7, 8, 9, 10 points. And then it kept slipping and slipping and slipping and slipping. I almost wanted to win to prove the exit polls wrong.
Yeah, that would have been the delicious victory. Do you lie awake thinking, wait a minute, was it that night there, or was it because I hired him, or was it that thing I said, or if I just at that luncheon, would that have made the difference because they wrote about that in a certain way? And do you have specific might-have-beens you think about?
I think that the price of the election being so close, I mean, there are a lot of advantages to it, including it gives everyone a really good feeling that we almost did it, and next time it might come out differently and all of that. But you do look at every decision and say, just one more thing, one right decision or one wrong decision made differently, and it would have been the 40,000 vote difference. Yeah. But I'm not a kind of a backward-looking person. I always look forward. So it's a fleeting thought rather than anything I spend a lot of time thinking about.
But you seem to be suggesting vaguely that we might hear from you again politically.
Well, I think so. I don't know when or where at this point, but I enjoyed it. I think I learned a great deal.
Yeah.
I saw a tremendous enthusiasm for what I think I have to offer. So, sure, at some point in the future.
It could happen. I'm just not the only one imagining it then. Okay. Which comics will work for you in your next campaign?
I consider that my fault.
Yeah.
I think Jackie Mason was the victim of my not understanding that comedy and politics don't mix, and I think the things that he said and did are things which, in his comedy routine, perfectly acceptable, perfectly all right, but you do it in the middle of a political campaign, and people can put a different interpretation on it.
Yes, I have. Then when Woody Allen...
I think Woody Allen made that point, actually.
Made that point in slightly upstaging the man who was supposed to be helping that night. But, and that was out of proportion, too. I mean, the whole thing...
there was a friend of mine who's black who probably made the best point of all. He said he and his wife, about 10 years ago, went to a show. And when they walked in, the comic said some very insulting things about black people. And they were about to leave, really insulted. And then they sat there for an hour, and the comic then proceeded to insult Jews and Catholics and Italians and Germans and everybody else. By the end of the show, they realized that this is part of the humor. It is not anything directed at any one particular group. However, you take that out of context, you do it in the middle of a political campaign, and then you also get people who become very self-righteous about all of this.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, it becomes something different. And we should have understood that, meaning the political people should have understood that.
Yeah, I felt sorry for Mason on that. And although some of the things he said were a bit strange in his press conference afterwards, I had friends say, I can't imagine why he was dumb enough to say those. They're true, of course, but he shouldn't have. So I don't know where he feels he stands on this now. Is he helping any other politicians at the moment?
Oh, I think Jackie's a fine person, and I really like him very, very much.
Yeah, he is, and he isn't a racist.
And he just really cares about everybody. The difference is, you say it as comedy, everybody understands it. They write it in the Village Voice, and it sounds terrible. Print
doesn't have a very good sense of inflection,
right?
And I really think he was a victim there too. It's a funny sensation to see you there wearing a microphone and wired, because it brings up one of the things I really like to know. When is it possible in prosecuting a case to seemingly break the law, as when people, as we know, have been kind of bribed to draw other people into a case. Where do you draw the line on that?
Well, you have to have a real good knowledge of the constitutional law and the laws. Some states permit wiring telephone conversations, others don't. You have to know the difference between the two.
Well, say when the FBI bribes somebody, isn't bribery a crime?
Yeah, if you use the general legal standard, what you've got to do is try to leave the decision to commit the crime to the person. You offer them the opportunity to commit it, but you don't induce them into doing it. You don't push them into doing it. There's a whole complex law of entrapment that applies, which includes...
Well, is it clear, that law of entrapment, or is it murky?
No law is ever clear.
Well, and that's why they call them laws, maybe.
Predisposition has something to do with it, too. If a person has shown a propensity to commit this kind of crime before, it's less likely that the defense of entrapment will work for them.
So if you leave a diamond necklace out and go in the back room, is that a fair way to capture somebody you think has been?
That would be fairly neutral.
Yeah.
If you start pressuring the person into stealing the diamond necklace, if you threaten them into doing it, then that would be illegal.
We know that's happened.
Oh, sure.
When you encountered it, did you quash it immediately?
Yes, sure. There are cases that you decline to prosecute because maybe even the law wasn't violated, but it just isn't right. I mean, things have gone just a little too far. People who do their jobs well do them with enthusiasm, and federal agents and prosecutors can sometimes go too far also.
I was talking to a real prosecutor about that sort of thing. It always makes us kind of queasy, I think, when we read about it, where people are given the opportunity to commit a crime, to pull their colleagues into it. There was a lot of this surrounding the Ivan Boesky case and so on. We still don't know, do we, whether or not he wore a wire, as they say, or maybe you know.
I know, but I can't say.
You know, but you can't say. Is that a hint? Yeah. And the morality of that is really kind of scary. Are there cases you can win that you don't feel good about?
Sure. There are cases that you can win that you actually don't even go with because the things that were done in the case were maybe a little too close to the line, or sometimes the punishment is just out of proportion to what somebody did wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, so that's prosecutorial discretion is really not about cases cases that are just easy ones. They're about the tough cases that maybe you can win, but you just don't go with.
Can you think of one and give us an example of that?
Sure. I can give you an example of one in which I guess it happens in tax cases sometimes where people make mistakes and it's way out of proportion to anything that they really did wrong, and their whole life will be ruined. I can think of a case that I had involving a doctor who had devoted a lot of his life to helping people, helping with AIDS. It turned out that he was so busy he wasn't paying his taxes, and we were able to settle it civilly, but we decided not to criminally prosecute him.
Now, would Socrates say that what you've just said is outrageous? I mean, in other words, you're deciding ahead of time who to apply the law to, and maybe you're wrong, and maybe that doctor who's supposedly helped people was really a drug pusher.
You really try very hard to apply the same principles to everyone. And I found being a prosecutor harder than being a candidate, because the judgments you have to make as a candidate are pretty clear. You go out and argue your case, and you do the best you can. As a prosecutor, you really have people's lives in your hands, and you really want to try to be fair.
Yeah.
Including when you do prosecute. I mean, very many times people will have a very compelling story to tell, but you've heard it so often, and it applies to so many different people, you just have to go ahead with the case.
But in that thing you said about you found out someone is a good person and maybe their one error doesn't outweigh a lifetime of stuff, isn't there an element in that of you are judging them ahead of time? Suppose you did find out afterwards that the guy had been a guard at Buchenwald.
Then you could probably prosecute the case. Usually when you decline prosecution because of some very sympathetic fact, if that fact turns out to be false, you can go ahead and prosecute the case. It's not like someone being acquitted where there's double jeopardy.
But again, aren't you sort of saying one of the nice things about being a prosecutor is you can go after the people you think are really the bad people, and if your brother's committed the same crime or a guy who gives to Boys Town, let him go.
You pretty much apply neutral principles. The same principles you'd apply to one person, you'd apply to another. People who voluntarily disclose the fact that they haven't paid their taxes are generally not prosecuted.
When they voluntarily do.
When they voluntarily disclose it. That applies to everyone, so that it doesn't just apply to one person or another. Unless some aggravating fact is involved, like they hadn't done it for many, many years, or they were hiding enormous amounts of money. And the Justice Department, I was a federal prosecutor, there were actually guidelines that you use that are written out so that you're not ending up just applying your own gut instinct, but there are some neutral principles that you can apply to it.
Could you be trapped?
Could I be trapped?
Would you be trapped? What would it take? If leaving here, a guy says, I know some stuff about D'Amato that nobody knows.
It would be tough to do.
Meet me tonight behind Phil's hamburger stand.
I think it would be kind of tough to get me to do that.
They must have tried. Be great, wouldn't it, for somebody to lure you into something?
When you run for office, they throw all sorts of things at you, including things that you never thought anybody would ever question. So you hope it doesn't get you paranoid.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I try not to. I try not to go too far with it, but I'm pretty careful.
What are some dirty little secrets of yours that could have come out in the campaign?
Every single one of them came out,
So they did?
and a few that weren't even secrets.
Yeah.
The campaign got pretty low at certain points.
Yeah, it did, didn't it?
I mean,
When did you ever say to Roger Ailes what George Bush apparently didn't? Let's not just consider winning everything.
Well, gee, I thought the other side was a lot worse than we were. So I think Roger Ailes got sort of became a lightning rod for many things that he had nothing to do with.
Did he?
Some of the cheapest things that were done against us, not by us.
Yeah.
I mean, there were columns written by columnists about my first marriage and all sorts of things that you would think had nothing to do about my religion. The kinds of things that people didn't go into as to my opponent.
You were just saying during the break that in the couple weeks after the campaign, you began to realize how weary you were, or how high up you get,
right.
A thing like that.
It took about 2 or 3 days to even realize how tired I was.
Yeah.
And then you realize that it's been months and months and months since you had a day off, and a lot of nights in which you missed any kind of sleep or any kind of really meaningful sleep. And actually it takes 2 or 3 weeks to really start to feel like normal again.
From what you said in the last segment, you still get to be irked by the nature of some of the campaigning against you. The ones that stung again were what? The one about your earlier marriage?
Sure, and sort of intruding into things that you would think have nothing at all to do with being mayor, including religion and your religious beliefs and your conscience and things that I thought got very intrusive. My policy was I'd answer every question. A few times I would say to reporters, "Do you really want to ask that question? I'll answer it if you want me to."
Yeah.
And because I don't want you to think I have anything to hide, because I don't.
Right.
But do you really want to ask me about my first marriage or annulments or that sort of thing? Since those are really religious things. But they would go ahead and ask anyway, and I would answer.
But isn't it a little disingenuous to say a politician's religious beliefs have nothing to do with his?
No, I think they do, but I think how far you go intruding into someone's life is a mistake that we're making in America right now.
Well, if we were during the campaign and I were assigned to get your position on abortion, which as far as I read it shifted once or twice, I would, or something, let's say specifically like, there's a woman in California, a legislator, who came out pro-abortion and the Catholic Church denies her communion. Are they right or wrong?
I think you're right to ask somebody's position on abortion, and that's a public position. It's something you have to vote on if you're a legislator. If you're a mayor, it's something you have to speak out on. I never felt that was intrusive to ask me that. As far as my relationship to my church over that position, that's a little bit intrusive. And I mean, I've been a public official a long time. I know the difference between being a public official and being a member of a church. One has never intruded into the other, and you would think people could take you at your word for
now,
that.
Then if I was that reporter asking that question, at what point did I become intrusive? When I ask you whether you think the Catholic Church is right to deny that woman communion, am I prying?
Sure.
In other words, you're not willing to answer the question, are you?
No, what I would do is I would suggest to the person that I'm not a priest and I'm not a theologian, so my view on this is not worth very much. But if you want it, I'll tell you what my view is.
Go ahead. What the hell?
I think that the church has to recognize that public officials have to make decisions governing a large group of people, many of whom aren't Catholics. And you have to, as a public official or a potential public official, you've got to take that into consideration. A priest doesn't have to take that into consideration. So that if you're going to govern people who feel as a matter of conscience that abortion is right, and people who feel as a matter of conscience that abortion is wrong, you got to find a middle ground that permits both of those views to get legitimacy.
It's still hard to see how you can divide yourself that way, but I guess Has to be done. During the break, we were talking. In the last segment, we were talking about the problem for a religious candidate having to divide the thought, so to speak, about things. Now, on the abortion issue, what was perceived as your shifting was what again?
It really wasn't that much of a shifting. It was maybe because it happened in the middle of a campaign. My personal position on abortion has always been that whatever your religious beliefs or whatever advice you would give to someone, ultimately a woman has to make a choice, and you've got to support that. Even if you might advise her, well, maybe it'd be better to have the baby. So if you take that personal position and you reflect it publicly, it becomes a pro-choice position. However, one where if I were making the choice, maybe I would advise that it'd be better to have the baby. Ultimately, if a woman makes the decision that she wants to have an abortion, I think she has to have the right to make that decision about her own body, realizing how difficult that is.
And does that mean you're of two minds on the subject or of one mind?
No, it means it's a very, very complex issue that, it might be difficult, but if people think a little bit, this isn't so hard, that you can be pro-choice, but personally feel that the better option would be not to have an abortion. Ultimately, you've got to let each woman decide it for herself, however.
Suppose the man who resides in the house behind St. Patrick's called you during the campaign and says, if you say any more things that seem to be pro-abortion, I'm going to fix you, and I'm going to deny this phone call.
Well, that misunderstands the role of the church and of government in America and of the First Amendment.
It strikes me that the late Cardinal Spellman would be capable of almost any sleaziness, let alone that one.
Then you've got to have the understanding of what democracy is all about in America and the American Constitution.
And remind him of that.
My obligation as a public official is to everyone, not just to Catholics. It's to everyone.
Yeah. I don't know why I'm so hard on Cardinal Spellman, except that there was so little to admire in him, and some of the things he did were really quite amazing. Has there ever been a good book about him? Did you know him?
I didn't know him, except as a young student. He probably came to my college at one point or other. I don't think he did, but I didn't know him personally in any way.
Do we apparently still get this sort of thing? In Kazan's book, he talked about the movie Baby Doll, and when it came out, certain priests stood in the lobbies and took the names of people who went in to see it because it had been forbidden to see it. That seems almost like 100 years ago, and yet it was not. Just in the moment remaining, the idea of politics obviously appeals to you, and it's quite clear you're going to be back. Is one of the appeals the fact that someday you could get $2 million for a 5-day trip to Japan,
No.
or maybe even closer?
No, actually, it's easier to do that outside of politics. As a lawyer or as a businessman, anyone who is attracted to politics for money is looking at the wrong business.
Really?
Sure. I mean, being a lawyer in private practice or being in business, you're going to make a lot more money than you are in politics. I think the attraction of politics, or the correct attraction of politics, should be that it gives you a real satisfaction helping people. It allows you to build something
That would be
for
nice.
other people.
In the 10 seconds remaining, what job would you like Mayor Dinkins to appoint you to? Seriously.
I'm in private life right now. I'm not looking for a job, and
You mean you can't be had?
no, I can't be had.
Do you feel like a loser?
No, I don't feel like one. I wasn't happy with the verdict. I think the UN set a dangerous kind of unfortunate, took a step backwards in this question of expulsion. But life goes on, and it's going to be a tremendously challenging place to be in the weeks ahead, as you can well imagine. I just think the price tag was pretty high.
Well, now, this was, you sort of took the blame publicly.
Well, I think,
Should you have?
well, I'm arrogant enough to think I didn't make too many mistakes, but I think this, that the President and the Secretary of State did everything they possibly could do, and I think our mission made an excellent diplomatic effort. There was a tremendous amount of activity in the capitals, and thus I think it certainly was my responsibility. And if somebody's looking around for someone to blame, I'm there. But I'm not sure that from a very personal standpoint, I certainly did everything I could think of, and expect people can find mistakes. But I think we did a lot of things right, and I think we were up against a pretty difficult proposition, as it turns out.
What point did you know you'd lost control?
You know, we went in there, actually, in terms of votes, thinking that we were, you know, there could be slippage in some of the things, that representations that we had might have been weaker than others, that we thought we could win it by a vote or two. It was that close.
A vote or two?
Yeah, really,
Yeah.
that, just it's so hard, and, well, of course, you're only dealing with 131 countries. But I'd say about... after the debate, after the wrapping up of the speeches, we began to get reports of some slippage, and, you know, the things that we thought were final weren't, and so it became clear before the procedural votes were taken. There was only one key vote, Dick, and that was the important question vote, the non-expulsion vote. The Albanian resolution itself had the important question vote, non-expulsion vote, carried. It would have required 2/3, would never have had those majorities, because many people were, it's kind of like a political thing, you release delegates almost. I mean, people were scurrying for cover at that point. The important question, the non-expulsion vote, was the key vote at the United Nations Monday night.
How did they pull one over on the U.S. by, if that's in fact what happened, I mean, that's the way it's seen, by getting the vote that night when everyone seems to think if it had been the next day, President Nixon would have gotten what he, at that point, wanted.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that conclusion,
force it that night?
because I'm not sure that time at that point was working in our favor. This was something I talked to the Secretary of State about at night. But we did think the vote was going to be the next day. And one of the things at the UN that's very difficult to pin down are the procedures. I mean, it's very difficult to it's an emotional, political body, and it's very difficult to, in an orderly fashion, move the procedures that you think should be moved. There were several amendments offered at the last minute by two different ambassadors, the Saudi Arabia ambassador, the ambassador from Tunisia, that just kind of came out of a clear blue sky and kind of caused pandemonium and confusion. But and they were very serious about their effort and have every right to do it. But it made an orderly moving to, say, adjourn, if that was what was in our minds, and as I say, I'm not sure we would have gained anything, much more difficult.
So you're not sure that if...
No, I'm really not sure that if we'd had 12 hours more, that we could have picked up an extra vote or two, or, well, what we needed was 55, and we needed the change of 3 people, and I'm not sure we could have done that in another 12 hours, frankly. I'd like to.
Let's talk about the cheering and dancing in the aisles. Now, President Nixon made a statement that he was very upset by that spectacle. And many people who make a point of not agreeing with anything President Nixon says happen to agree with him on that. They said that was a disorderly insult to the, to this country and so on and so on. And but now another view of that cheering is that it was not against Taiwan largely, that the Chinese needn't be offended, but that it was against you representing the U.S. for their strong-arm bulldozing tactics and the fact that those had failed. Was what they were cheering about, that the big old USA could no longer twist people's arms.
Yeah, I expect there was some of that. But the thing, it wasn't glee and clapping that troubles the ambassadors today at the UN, or the Secretariat, or the members of Secretary General U Thant's staff. Many ambassadors have come up to me who were on the other side and said, well, this was an ugly spectacle. It wasn't glee. I mean, there was plenty of that there. But there was a certain... mood of ugliness, and the thing that troubled me about it was, and this I'm not being recriminatory, we're going forward, not backwards, but you've asked a very, question that's on people's minds. The thing that troubled me about it was, here were the Republic of China, decent men, having suffered indignity after indignity in the speeches, throwing them on the garbage heap of history, decent men sitting there, and then in their final moment of ignominy, not having the institution, the UN, not any delegation, but the UN as a body, not having the common decency to treat them as human beings. And this is what troubled me. And maybe maybe I shouldn't get so emotionally involved with people. But there's a way to do things with grace and dignity, and the organization simply did not do that. Now, as far as the United States goes, sure, there was some of that. I got up to speak afterward and was hissed from the audience, and we can take that. We can take care of ourselves. I didn't like it. I think it's beneath the dignity of the UN. But again, we can take care of ourselves. But what troubled the ambassadors there and the reporters there and the members of the Secretariat there was the mood not of glee. Heaven's sake, some people have been working for this for a long time, and in victory they should be grateful. But there was a certain ugliness there. There was a certain kind of you carry the iron sheet, and I'll have this forked stick, and we'll kind of jab one another. There was and some of it was just simply the culmination of victory after hard work, but I'm afraid it was a little uglier than that, and I think that's what the presidential spokesman was trying to say, and it's not a partisan thing. It's not aimed at any nation or anything like this, and the UN, in my view, will recover from it.
Anyways, getting back to steamroller tactics and all, I see the phrase annoys you. Probably bothers you.
Yeah, because frankly, we tried to conduct a reasonable campaign. I've seen the charges, and what I did and what I think the Secretary of State did in some 90 bilateral conferences with foreign ministers is explain very carefully, very clearly, and forcefully the policy of the United States government, which was, look, bring Peking in, but don't kick these other fellas out.
But forcefully, does that include taking things away from them? Because the one nation was quoted as saying, the Albanians came to us and said, we just saw you talking to the Americans. What did they offer you? We'll give you more. And the little nation said they didn't offer us anything. They told us what they were going to take away from us. In other words, they
I
threatened
reject
us.
that because that, I keep seeing that, and nobody ever quotes the nation.
What it was?
Who it was. And it's simply an unfair allegation because, now, I think I know all the contacts, or most of the contacts were made, and that is I think, an unfair allegation. Now, in terms of forceful advocacy of the United States policy, looking a fellow in the eye and saying, this is what we believe and what we think is best for the United Nations, we were unashamed to do that, and we made very forceful representations. But please believe me that we stopped, we did not get into threats or blackmail or this kind of tactic. But you got to remember, Dick, that at the same time we were working for this, there was tremendous pressure on the other side too. They were determined to do it, and determined to win on their terms. And the pressures there were plenty of pressures on the other side. You had tremendous pressure in the Arab group, for example, or in the Africans, who divided incidentally on this, right down the middle, 15-15 in terms of countries. And there were great pressures for our brethren, you got to vote this way. And so it was a very tense and very forcefully presented case, but
where do those charges come from, then?
Well, I don't know, and I'd like to see them documented because I have yet to find somebody to say, what about country XYZ? Somebody threatened to cut off helicopters or something. It just didn't happen there. And I know this. I was in charge of the effort. I guess I didn't know what everybody was doing at every minute because it was a major effort. And the other thing about it, it also is the American effort. Heavens, you've never seen people work as hard as the Japanese did. The Australians, New Zealanders, Thailand, Philippines, General Romulo, I don't know if you've ever had him on this show, but you ought to get him. He is the most colorful, tough little fellow. He's really terrific. And they all worked hard. It wasn't just a great American effort now, I think, at the end. There was you properly fingered some of this, well, we're glad to see the U.S. get beat thing. But that doesn't, that's not, we recovered from that.
Is the president mad at you, or was he?
No, he wasn't mad at me. In fact, he sent me a very courteous letter because, call because I think he feels that I ran a decent operation. But let him speak for that himself.
It's ironic because they say he wanted this, but yet he gained a great deal by losing in another sense. He gained a lot of support in this country if he lost some abroad.
Yeah.
So how do you...
You mean the kind of the bilateral relations with the Peking trip, you mean?
Well, it's just that either way the vote went, he had something to gain and something to lose. And I wonder if, looking back on it now, he feels that he may have gained, he may be happy.
No,
with
because
it.
I don't think that's true. I know darn well it's not true because I know he wanted to win. How do I know? Because he told me so, and he made it very clear to me. Yeah. But you see, our problem was we believed our policy. We believed in this theory of expulsion. Setting a precedent for expulsion by 50% is bad for the United Nations. We believed that the Republic of China, that's been a lawful member, a law-abiding member, should remain in there. And at the same time, we were offering affirming representation for Peking. That sometimes is forgotten, because what happened is over there, a lot of people say, well, you can't be serious if you say Republic of China should stay in. You know Peking will never come in if you do this, and therefore you can't be serious. But the president was deadly serious. He wants communication and better relations with Peking. He's taken some very bold steps that have captured the imagination of the diplomatic community and I think our country on this. But at the same time, he believed deeply in this principle of the retention of representation.
Are you, there are rumors that you might be a vice presidential name. Do those rumors interest you, amuse you?
Well, no, they're pure, wildly speculative rumors, and they don't hurt my feelings, but there's nothing to them. I mean, I know it probably doesn't sound like it, but I'm apolitical now, as I saw my distinguished friend Senator Muskie back there. He probably doesn't believe it either, but I am, and you know, I try to just focus on the fascinating work at the United Nations, and I have no political ambitions, plans, anything.
Would you accept it, though, if I offered it to you?
Cavett Bush ticket? I don't know. I'm not sure we'd get out of New York.
Ambassador Bush, have you met with any of the defeated people? Have you met with any of the Taiwan regime since
Yes,
they were?
I have.
Are they really bitter?
Well, the evening that the Minister Chow Su Kai walked out of there, I thought with great dignity. I went over and, of course, expressed our regrets and concern. Then the next day I went to call on him, and no, they're not. They're broad-gauged people, and they're very philosophical. I expect if you could look deep inside, you'd find that they were hurt. But they have an amazing self-respect and dignity, and their nation will continue. I mean, we are going to fulfill our commitments to this country, and other countries live happily outside the UN, Switzerland and Germany's and some of these. But again, I wish they were in instead of out. But no, they're conducting themselves with, I think, the dignity that you would expect and that we expect, and I think the people here would expect of them.
Let me change subject completely, but something that is really distressing. The other day, some bullets were fired into the Russian mission, or the Russian...
Yes, sir, the Russian mission.
And in a room where some children were playing.
Yeah, I went up there a few minutes after it happened.
And there was a violent scene in the UN the other day where people got up and denounced the security here and said we may have to move the UN out of New York for other reasons if they can't protect
snowball. It got
well. What can you say about that?
Well, first I can say that
if somebody gets killed, that's going to be really a
terrible thing. And first, I denounce this as a very cowardly act. Imagine lying on a building on top of Hunter College, firing bullets into in a room where 4 children are playing. And I went up there on behalf of my government. I was out at a big black-tie dinner, and so a message came in. I went over to the Soviet mission. I talked to their ambassador. They took me up and showed me the bullet holes, showed me the bullets there, showed me this scene, and met the mother, and just unbelievable terror. And we denounced this, and they arrested a fellow who has connections with the JDL, and whether he is guilty or not remains to be seen. But they traced the gun to him and all of this. And it's very difficult for foreign diplomats to understand how this kind of thing can go on, how we can keep from protecting him in this way. And it's a very troubling thing when this type of terroristic, cowardly activity goes on in our country. And the next day, Rabbi Kahane came over to our mission and wanted to talk to me. And I told him, you're hurting our country. You're hurting our relations with other countries. You're hurting the cause you profess to be for. And I want to have a dialogue. I said, I've seen your dialogue on the street, and it's not helping our country. And the Jewish leaders in our country are tremendously upset with him for this. There is a case. The Soviet Jewry thing is something that we've got to help solve, because the freedom of people to leave is terribly important. But to terrorize people, to put dynamite up against a building, or to walk in and spray paint on some secretary's eyes in the Soviet trading mission or something.
Did that happen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
In 2 incidents after the shooting, the very next day, 2 kids walked, I say kids, I don't know, hoodlums, walked into the Soviet mission, one with a hammer and broke the mirror in the front hall, and the other spraying paint. And then at the in-tourist office, the same thing happened. Now, this isn't the way you protest. This isn't the way you help your country or help a cause. And, of course, the responsible Jewish leadership has stood up as a man and said, we cannot have this. And every other American has done this. And I can understand the righteous indignation, but what happened at the UN, they started with a legitimate protest, and then it got into a very virulent, unpleasant scene there about berating not just the United States, but a kind of a unpleasant anti-Semitic thing. And we had to rise then and say, we don't like this violence, but I'm not going to let good Americans be slandered.
Now, who stood up and used the phrase "chosen people" in an anti-Semitic?
Well, that was an exchange between the Soviet ambassador and the ambassador from Israel, and it was rather unpleasant. No question about that. And the trouble is, you're dealing with excesses when you have these outrages. I mean, they lead to things. There's legitimate protest, and there's a legitimate cause, but it's not well served by these extreme acts. I'm pleased you brought it up, because I think people don't understand that sometimes.
And I just wonder if you can get enough security to keep people from
No, you can't. And
how
can you guard against a sniper on a roof? You could put policemen all around the building, and the police are doing an excellent job on trying to protect these people. I really believe this. But and they're fast, and they did a beautiful job of tracing down that rifle and the bullets and where it was purchased and all these things, and they respond just as quickly as they can. It's hard to guard against the coward huddling on a rooftop.
Yeah, impossible, just about.
It is.
Well, thank you very much for being here. I know you're busy and shuttling around constantly. And
great pleasure
nice
to have a chance to explain what was terribly important to our country, and thank you very much.
Hello.
This is most interesting, the situation. Could you explain how that came about, that you were opposed to the war and then entered it?
Well, I think that initially I wasn't so much opposed to the war as I was opposed to the entire policy of intervention which we were pursuing in this country. Mm-hmm. And I spoke more against that and against the draft and against Vietnam because it was part of that. Mm-hmm. And then I wound up going to Vietnam because in 1965, voicing an objection, as I would have liked to have at that point, would have been, I think, a very futile thing. And as a student of political science, I felt it'd be much, much smarter to try and find out really what it was that was happening there and what the war is about, and then come back and speak from a position of strength, which I think I can do now. And really, with all due respect to the Director of Communications, what I think we have in this country on the war as well as on other issues is a failure to communicate. And I think it's becoming a very, very significant thing right now, which hasn't been addressed by the President and by the administration.
Mm-hmm. It's very unusual to be, it's hard to see how you can be opposed to the war and then participate in it.
Well, as I say, my opposition to the war was not at that time a strongly moral opposition. It wasn't an opposition on grounds of what was happening in Vietnam. It was an opposition that was based on our broad spectrum of foreign policy. The fact that we have troops in over 100 nations and that we're defended to commit 100 nations. We have troops in over 40. We're giving aid to over 30. This kind of extension bothered me and still does. But as to the war in Vietnam, at that time the administration was still talking about going to Vietnam in order to try and allow the government to exist in the form that we felt was advantageous to it. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that meant giving them elections. Well, this changed radically after I was in fact sworn in and after I was a member of the armed forces. I think it really changed towards the end of 1965. We had 200,000 troops at the end then and went up to 550,000 in the next 2 years. Mm-hmm. And I think the difference is when I began to crystallize my thoughts.
Dick, in view of your question, I think one key thing is that a great number of young men who serve with Mr. Kerry don't go there because they think it's something that they want war or that they maybe support this war, but they go because it's their duty to their country. And I think that few Americans really want war of any kind.
Well, frankly, I don't think that I know very many American soldiers who look at it that way. unknown to many people in this country, Bob Hope tried to defend the war in Vietnam this year, and he was booed.
Where was that?
This was in Long Binh, just outside of Saigon.
I didn't know that.
He was booed. And I know from my point of view, what I found over there was, I've lived part of my life in France, and during this period I used to go out and I'd see the bunkers outside of the houses, and you could get a very distinct impression for what it was like to be a country completely at the mercy of a foreign force. And quite frankly, when I was in Vietnam, I have to say to you that I just could never feel that I was there fighting to save that country, to make it safe for democracy. The only feeling you could have was that you were like the German, that you were there occupying another country. And really this feeling of imperialism is one that actually does pervade much of the world now when they look at the United States of America.
I think the thing you'd have to recognize is points you made that we'd build up to 535 or 545,000 troops, and we're continuing to do this. The policy's changed since then, and the policy is to build up the ability of those people to defend themselves in their own area.
Well, this is really the tragedy. Mr. Klein, this is really the tragedy, because the fact of the matter is that really the only change in the policy has been a change from admitting that we were there to try and defend that country from communism to changing it so that we can get out of there somehow to save face for the United States of America. And I frankly think that the loss of lives that is going to be entailed in that, and if Vietnamization is successful, which I personally don't feel it can be, if it is successful, that means another 5,000 to 20,000 U.S. lives will be lost. And I'd like to take a tally in this country and see how many people are willing to be those lives, willing to say, I'll be patient. And I don't think you'd find very many who'd say, I'll give my life so that we can get out of Vietnam and save our face, so that sometime in the future North Vietnam can turn around and reinvade and take over, or that the terrorism can continue.
I think your figures on casualties will, I would hope they prove very wrong, and I'm sure they will. But you want to look at the fact that the man who's making the decision probably feels more than anyone the loss of a life, and it's the president. Any president does. And look at the fact also that the lowest casualty rate we've had has been during the first quarter of this year, which would indicate that the program we have is working.
Well, this is what I don't understand. I don't see how you can talk about lowest casualty rate. I think any casualty rate at this point is absurd. I think when you look at what we've done to Vietnam, 200,000 civilians a year are killed. 85% of all the casualties are civilian. 1 out of every 5 children in South Vietnam lives to be 5 years old. Saigon, a city built for 500,000 people, now has 3,500,000 people in it, and it's completely bankrupt in terms of everything due to the black market, due to the slums that have grown through it. I think it's an absurd thing to talk about low casualty rates. I think the time has come for this country to try and cease to operate on a basis of its paranoia to communism, because in fact we have no interest whatsoever in South Vietnam. And the true fact of the matter is that in terms of what's happening in this country now, we have to pay attention to the students, I think, who are getting their heads cracked open in the streets because of something they believe in very, very deeply. And I can't believe that we can continue to lose lives either in Vietnam or in this country without a tremendous reprisal of some kind.
Well, I think if you were to assume that this is correct, you'd have to assume that if you pulled everybody out tomorrow, there'd be no loss of life, which just wouldn't be the fact. I think the other thing you have to look at is we're talking in terms of a world policy and whether we're people who carry out what we say we will one way or the other. We're carrying out our effort, which is the pledge to withdraw as quickly and as honorably as possible. I think if you take American credibility, it's important in terms of what we're doing to try to prevent war in the Middle East, for example, a very dangerous area.
Well,
it's important in all types of credibility.
Excuse me, we do have a message, and I know you have
I'm going to
another
have to go
engagement.
because of another engagement, and I do.
I was going to mention that earlier, and I'm sorry I did not. But thank you for being here.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Kerry, tell us exactly what your position was and your rank and all, and what you did in Vietnam.
I was a lieutenant junior grade, and I was in command of a twin-screw, 50-foot aluminum-hulled patrol boat called a patrol craft fast.
Yeah.
It's a ancestor, really, of the PT boat of World War II, more than anything else. And our duties ranged. Initially, when I went to Vietnam, I thought, frankly, that I wouldn't see that much war. And we were supposed to surveil the coast for interdiction of arms. And about 2 weeks before I got there, the concept changed. They started sending us in the rivers which really weren't much wider than this studio, and we went on raids up these rivers with orders to fire on huts and any target of opportunity in order to prove to the Viet Cong that they didn't own the rivers. And this was the essential strategy.
And you have some film of that.
Yes, I do. I took some 8mm Super 8 film.
You took the film yourself.
I took it
Could we run that, and will you
myself,
tell us what is happening somewhere?
monitor.
You'll find a monitor. There's
Where
one
do I
up
find
there.
a monitor?
Oh.
Well, these are shots. Right now you see a bunker being taken under fire. In fact, we're under fire at this point, and you can see some shots coming out, landing in the water. We're moving in one of the rivers. This is a larger river in the Mekong Delta called the Kualan River. We came under fire on our way to a mission. The boats were in line. You see them. We're just out of the kill zone, the area in which we could really be hit. And now we've recommenced. We're starting up another river. And we had about 30 Vietnamese troops on the back here of the boats, so our speed was slowed way down. And just after this, I put the camera down. I had a feeling we were going to be ambushed. And sure enough, up ahead, we were, and you'll see it. You see across the river there, fish stakes, which were a great impediment to our progress. We had to stop completely. You can see the speed we were going. And what happened was we were taken under fire, and I felt we didn't have enough speed to get out of this area because of the troops on the back of the boat. So to try and save the men and the troops on the boat, I decided the best thing to do was charge the ambush. And we turned the boats towards the ambush, went straight into it and beached, and succeeded somehow, and frankly, I don't even know how, in overrunning the ambush. And after the initial action, I wanted to record this because this had never really happened to us before. And so I took these pictures in a moment of confusion, modern-day John Wayne there. And it was really a very tragic scene because after all the hurly-burly and after the fighting and the shooting, there was nothing left once we withdrew. And it struck me, and I think you'll see this scene in a moment. Now you see smoke blowing across. One of the men had gone up, I don't know why or who, but he set fire to the huts that were there, and they'd found some enemy ammunition in it. And I was constantly struck by the juxtaposition of those of us running around with guns and the body lying there in the field. And there you see the huts burning, and this is the enemy, so to speak, in South Vietnam. This is a soldier who insisted on having his picture taken with the body. This is general confusion here.
How do you...
Now, I think there's a picture as it ends. You see the field completely empty and the body just lying there. And this is what I was so frankly continually struck by.
How do you explain the fact that you, who were wounded and did all this, feel one way about what happened there, and how there other soldiers feel, those who did not boo Bob Hope, let's say, have such another feeling?
Well, I think it depends on where you are and what you're doing. I think that anybody who gets into combat, anybody who hears the bullets whistling over his head and sees one of his friends killed, or has a friend dying beside him with his eyes just looking up at you saying, why? I think that anybody who senses these things can't help but feel a total revulsion for the absurdity and stupidity of men shooting at other men, particularly men with whom you have absolutely no quarrel, men who really are fighting on their own land, in their own country, for their own existence. And I think that's the difference, really.